false rain orchid, the green flowers. We think that it might be pollinated by male mosquitoes. So,
wow. Interesting.
and they are quite fragrant. I had read that they stink, that they have a fetid smell, and I don't have a very good sniffer, so I was never actually able to smell them. So here we have the royal fern, and the little side leaflets are widely spaced. It's what gives it its name. It's got this grand appearance, is what apparently makes it royal. They used to be in the same genus, the cinnamon fern and the royal fern, but cinnamon fern's been taken out and given its own genus. This one has stayed right where it was before, in the genus Osmunda. Next to it we have the interrupted fern. It's called interrupted because this fern, the interrupted maiden fern, does not have a special frond that it gives over for the production of spores. It just takes a normal frond, and you can see the tiny little spore producing structures are arranged along the edge of the little pinnules here, and there's a gap in between. At the tip of the lobes there's a gap in the continuous snaking around of the sporangia, and that's what's interrupted about it, because they don't form a complete chain. But these can be easily confused with the cinnamon fern. They have that same pinnate pinnatifid leaf arrangement, but the cinnamon fern does not produce its sporangia like that. So if you see something that looks very cinnamon-like, check for fertile fronds. The swamp fern, very typical and unique to the swamp fern. The sporangia are right there along the mid-vein. It also has a very kind of rude terminal leaflet there. Somebody says it looks like it's giving you the finger. So, and this is a huge variety of ferns through here, but with practice and time you can start to tell them apart. Do y'all remember what this one is? With the well-spaced royal. That's royal. Just watch where you step. There's little cactus. There might be little cactus. Come on through. Here's a cactus. Here's what they look like. So cactus are flowering plants. Their leaves have been modified into these spines. Their stems do all the photosynthetic business. So these little pads are actually stem tissue, and the leaves are nothing but the spines. They've adapted for succulent habit. They can store water, and they use it very efficiently. The way that they close their stomata, their little pores, during the day to keep from losing water, and they open them at night when it's not quite so hot, and so they wait to do the photosynthesis until the dark time. It's a special kind of adaptation to arid climates. They are a flowering plant. The cactus belong to a flowering plant family, and they do flower and they do produce fruit with seeds inside. A lot of people like to eat the prickly pear fruit. The tortoise certainly does, and that's how the seeds of the cactus get moved around. But these pads are very, very loosely connected. They're very fragile, and those spines would love to hook into your shoe, and then when you go over there and groom and get the pad off your shoe, that pad can start to grow into another plant. So not only can it flower and sexually reproduce, but it has that cloning ability. Smart weeds, I don't know what's so smart about it. Polygonella, but just tiny little tubular white flowers. It's actually related to buckwheat. And once the fruit is ripe, it kind of scatters on the ground, and we get another plant. This is an annual plant. This doesn't live from year to year. So next spring, the seeds will sprout and grow throughout the summer, flower towards the end of summer, and start the next generation.
And what's the name of it again?
Polygonella, smartweed. joint weed. It has these kind of bluish stems.
Oh, look how pretty.
Yeah, I think they're quite, I mean, they're subtle, but they're quite lovely. And the little yellow daisies.
And then what you step on the rabbit poop.
Rabbit poop. The yellow daisies, these are just coming obviously to the end of their flowering time. This one's called Pityopsis, which means it looks like pine. The leaves are very narrow and needle-like, so before it flowers, somebody thought that it, probably Linnaeus, decided to call it Pityopsis because it looks like a pine. But these leaves are very well adapted to this very dry and sandy soil. They're silvery. You see how the leaves are silver. They can reflect sunlight. It's kind of like sunscreen, and they're covered in hairs. And those silky hairs help trap a layer of moisture right around the leaf so it doesn't dry out as fast. And the surface area isn't very great either. So it has all these adaptations to living in a very, very dry, sandy area. These flowers have already shed all their seeds. There's a few more to come. But this is in the aster family, like the climbing aster that we saw before, the daisies. It's got that typical daisy flower. But that's not a flower. I've probably said this a million times. That's not one flower. That's about 24 flowers. And each one of the flowers matures into an individual fruit that's carried on a parachute. So those are individual little fruits from one separate flowers, and the sepals of those flowers are going to expand into little plumes that'll help carry those fruits with one seed inside. This weird, that's all you get. This is a fern. Technically, it's a fern. It's called whisk fern, Psilotum. It represents, with the ferns, some of the very first of the land plants. It's a spore-producing plant. It does have roots, so it is technically a vascular plant. They can get to be, they can form pretty huge colonies, but they're just weird. They're like another planet, the whisk ferns. At the right time of the year, they form these little sporangia that look different from the typical fern sporangia, but they serve the same function of reproduction. And they also have that alternation of generation. So that's Psilotum, Psilotum, or whisk fern. This goes even further back in time than the ferns and the whisk ferns. This is true moss. These are bryophytes. They belong to the group of plants that were very first to colonize the land. They're also spore-producing plants, obviously. Seeds weren't invented until much later. But the alternation of generations in the mosses happens on the same plant. So the plant that produces the sperm cells is growing over here, and that swims over to the plant that's produced the egg cells. The next generation grows out of the top of that plant into the spore capsule, which you could probably picture mosses with their little spore capsules sticking up. It's just now getting time to be for these to start producing, but I don't see any right now. But these are non-vascular plants. These don't have any plumbing. They can't move water through their body, so that's why they grow so low. They depend on rainwater to wash over them to facilitate that. Here's the crustose kind of epiphytic. Crustose means it's like paint. You can't flick this organism off the trunk of the tree. It's not harming the tree at all. It's just sitting there living. I believe it's the bacteria that gives it this color, this wonderful pink color that's so striking, especially on a day like this. You can really see it. There's all kind of stuff growing on this. There's other kinds of lichen. There's mosses. There's free-living algae. The orange is a free-living algae, an actual epiphytic algae, if you can believe that. This little tiny little patch is real fun to watch all year because this area was burnt probably 7 years ago. The saw palmetto haven't closed back in on themselves right here, and it's given the wildflowers plenty of room to grow, and so year round there's something flowering in here. It's real fun to watch. The Pityopsis is still going. There's pennyroyal comes up in here, and that's the kind of ecosystem we're trying to restore here in Brooker in these upland habitats, using fire to keep the space open to allow for the diversity that we lose when things get overgrown. The poor bay trees, they just can't get a break. This one has some kind of blood-sucking insect. You see how neatly they're arranged along the veins?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
They're taking sap, but they're taking more than they can handle, and they're pooping it out. It's shooting out the other end. And sap, of course, has sugars in it, and this black mold loves to eat the sugars. So the sugars cover the leaf, the mold eats the sugar, and this poor thing just can't get a break from between laurel wilt and all these other things that attack it. I wouldn't use that in your cooking. Here's one that has leaf miner. So there's another insect that's feeding. And as it feeds, it's right underneath the top cell layer, so it's protected, and it's just chewing away. You can see it's deformed, the leaf. But this part is still photosynthetic. It's still working as hard as it can to stay alive and keep the plant alive. This is the upland, the one that's adapted to living in dry. And it's got kind of blunt leaf tips. The other species has very long tapering to a point. You probably won't find them growing next to each other. They live the same way. They have the same flowers, they have the same fruit, they just happen to be two separate species because based on some morphological characteristics. They probably flower at different times of the year. They do produce little blackberries. We leave them for the animals. The blackberries that we buy have been bred to be much bigger than anything you would find in the wild. But they still get the job done. They produce a fruit that's edible with the seeds inside that whoever eats it, craps it out later, starts a new blackberry. It is armored to prevent being eaten, and it also uses these little hooks, these little prickles, to lean on other plants and kind of grow up through them as well. So they're kind of like grappling hooks. And so they get up into the sunshine. Oh, here's some of that pennyroyal I was telling you about earlier. Have y'all smelled it? Everybody smell pennyroyal? You want to just don't eat it. So this is in the mint family, and like other members in the mint family is quite has found its way into very arid environments, like the Mediterranean. And a lot of our culinary herbs are in the mint family, and they're native to the Mediterranean. And they have adaptations, just like this plant, of concentrating highly aromatic oils in their leaves, because those oils don't evaporate, so that's a way of kind of hanging on to some moisture. They might be distasteful. To us, we love them, but to grazers, they might not be so into it. Because of their pungency, they've often been used medicinally. Like if it smells that strongly, it's gotta work for something. And there are several plants that are in different genera that are referred to as pennyroyal. This is not the European pennyroyal that has been used medicinally for years. As far as I know, the Native Americans didn't have any. Well, they took everything for a stomachache, apparently. I was reading them, ethnobotany, everything they would eat or drink or make a tea out of for a stomachache. I don't know if any of it worked, but
Some of it probably causes stomach
I was
aches.
yeah,
yes, right.
yeah. So I'll take something else.
Is this, James? Is
That's
this
the
a
black
gall?
bear.
Is this a gall on there or the?
Oh yes, it is. Oh, well
And this was
spotted.
on that laurel that you had.
Yeah. Now the laurel again just doesn't get a break. This leaf barely got started before it got attacked by psyllids. P-S-Y-L-L-I-D. Have you heard of citrus greening? Of course you have. That's caused by one of these insects called a psyllid. They secrete a chemical that acts like a plant hormone, and that causes this leaf to grow this tissue that it wouldn't naturally make, and it gives protection to the psyllids that live in there. They're itty bitty, and they also feed on that spongy material once the plant produces it. So this is a type of gall. There are several gall-forming organisms, and the psyllids also create this waxy substance, which you can see after I've broken it open. It's kind of white, waterproof, waxy. Interesting. Because they're all living inside that thing, and they're all excreting their waste. And so this helps, that wax somehow keeps them dry and keeps them out of their own crap, I suppose. This rubus, this blackberry, has also been attacked by a gall-forming insect, I assume. You see the stem swelling here? It's very likely that a wasp flew up to this. The gall-forming wasps are very fascinating. They have stingers that are modified into egg-laying structures. They're not defensive, but they're egg-laying structures. And their venom has been converted into a plant hormone mimic. So they inject an egg and some growth hormone mimic. It causes the plant to produce this unnatural tissue that the young wasp, once it hatches, can feed on. And then it gets worse because another wasp comes along, a different species, and can detect the presence of a larva inside this gall, uses her stinger to lay her egg on this larva, so when that egg hatches, it eats that one. These are the sand live oaks. They're live oaks because they're evergreen. They do shed their leaves in the spring, and their leaves are very, very substantial. They're leathery, they're very thick, and they're fuzzy, and they make these little canoe shapes. That's how they grow on the tree. And in the spring they drop these leaves, and those leaves can collect rainwater. And so this oak kind of makes an apron of little water holding structures so that if a fire were to move this way, it might extinguish before it got to the tree. Oaks are not fire adapted. So this one apparently is trying to put the fire out before it gets to it. It's a pretty clever adaptation of the sand live oak. It's Quercus geminata. Gemini, the twins, it produces 2 fruits side by side. So there's 2 female flowers that emerge from nearby, from the same bud, so that the acorns are produced as twins. So there's the geminata, the pair of acorns. That's not unique to this oak, but it helped someone give it its name.
And this sand pine has the little cones in it too.
Has it made cones? Are those
Yeah, I
cones
see.
or leaves?
I don't know. I can't tell. Now that you say that. One's a leaf for sure.
Yeah. You'd have to get up in there.
Yeah, I can't tell.
We have an expert on galls who is one of the only people that are studying them as closely as she is. She's in graduate school now, and she's writing her thesis on the gall wasps that affect the shrub oaks because they're easy to get to. If you study the live oak gall-forming wasp, you'd have to be up there, so she's a clever lady. So she's studying the wasps that are associated with these lower growing, like this myrtle oak and the Chapman's oak that don't get as big. But there's the chaff. There's the head of chaff, which is the stuff that's associated with seeds. It's a member of that same group of plants that I mentioned before that produce a whole bunch of tiny little flowers in one spot, and then each one of the flowers becomes an individual fruit on a flying. The flowers were purple, light lavender, late summer flowering. This is Trelissa subtropicanus. vanilla leaf is the common name, although this species has been taken out of the same species as what is truly the vanilla leaf. These leaves lack any scent at all, which is one of the differences between the two. The true vanilla leaf grows north of here, and it was called vanilla leaf. It actually does have a scent in that species, odorata, aptly named, and they were used in cigar making to impart kind of a vanilla flavor, which I can't imagine made a cigar taste any better, but they used it for that. But we don't harvest any of our leaves here for any reason. We just leave them on their own. Now, do you know what the gall is? The gallbladder? What's in the gallbladder? Bile. Bile. Bile is very bitter. So is this. I don't know how many times I told my coworkers this story, and a couple weeks ago I was with both of them and they popped one in their mouth just to see if it was edible. Boss is studied dendrology. She's a tree person, so she spent her career looking up at trees. And I'm more of a herbaceous guy, so I spent most of my career looking down here. So we kind of complement each other. But I wanted to learn the trees, and I thought I would start with the oaks because they're the hardest. So we have a list of all the plants that have been found here at Brooker Creek on our 9,000 acres. And I said, I'm going to make this my checklist. I'm going to try and find all these species of oak. And there are 2 dwarf oaks. There's the dwarf live oak, and there's the running oak. And I walked past dwarf live oak for years looking for it, and it's right here. So this is the dwarf live oak, and it really does live up to its name. This is all you get. Full-size acorns, though. Wow. Yeah. This colony produced an acorn this year, and it was really comedy to look at it, just sitting here on this tiny little thing. So I guess it's called a dwarf live oak because it's evergreen like the live oaks, but the leaf outline is nothing like the live oak, the large live oak. They can appear to be quite prickly, in fact.
Looks like holly almost.
It does with those kind of toothed leaf edges.
Was chewing on it. Someone did.
So you can see the kind of toothy leaf margins of this dwarf live oak. Little nest right here. Like I said before, once the leaves start coming off, you start to see all kind of stuff that you would have missed otherwise. This oak is pretty easy to identify. This is the blue jack oak, and it has the kind of blue-gray underside. It's a bit more pronounced early in the spring when the leaves are new. These are in the process, obviously, of the tree is in the process of losing its leaves. But the blue jack oak, not only from the distinctive leaves, but you can also tell from the bark of this one. Here's a grown-up blue jack down here. And the bark is very dark, and it's made of these tiny little, like, tiles. You know what I'm trying to say, mosaic tiles? So that's typical of the blue jack oak bark. So it does get to be quite a large plant. This scrawny oak is the turkey oak. And here's its turkey foot shaped leaf. They can be quite large. This just happens to be the only one that we have access to. We have some huge ones across the power lines, which is off limits. But that's how it gets its name. It has the leaf shape that's similar to a turkey's foot. This one's got a little bit of arthritis, but... Okay, we're going downhill fast. So you'll see the sand behind us is going to become muck as we go down just a couple of feet in elevation. And the plant communities are going to change as well. This ground cover really surprised me. I studied botany in Tennessee and North Carolina, and I got to know all those wonderful mountain plants that love that cool, damp, mountain conditions. And I met this thing called Michella repens twinberry, and thought that was cool, blah, blah, blah. And then I moved back to Florida and get this job, and here it is growing in Florida, and I never thought it would. It's an interesting evergreen ground cover. It's one of those native plants that people like, who are into native plants, would like to have this plant. The ovaries of two flowers next to each other are fused together. So this plant produces two flowers that have a single ovary. And so that's how it gets its name, the twin flower or twin berry. Another name is partridge berry. The berries are bright red. And this plant flowers very heavily in the spring. It's a lovely thing, but I have never once seen it produce a fruit. But you can see it certainly has crept far and wide to form this nice patch. So now we're back in the muck. You can see all the organic material mixed in with the sand here. Generally in upland areas where the sand exists, the organic material washes all the way through. But here we are almost at the lowest point, and the organic material is conserved. And now we've got the perfect habitat again for the cinnamon ferns and the swamp ferns and so on. Here's one of our little epiphytic orchids, the Encyclia tampensis orchid that flowers in June. They're pretty widespread throughout this swamp. There's just a few places where you can see them. I'll show you where to look next June, where we have branches that are absolutely festooned with flowers. We're standing next to a cypress dome. It may or may not have been formed by a sinkhole. We're back down to the creek, so it could just be a place where cypress found the right conditions to germinate and grow. But you can see the typical pond cypress knees. Those are referred to as pneumatophores. There's a belief that they aid in gaseous exchange with the root system. Plants that grow in stagnant water don't have access to very much dissolved oxygen. It's usually used up by whatever critters are living in that water. So it's believed that these knees help get oxygen to the root system. But they also produce, like buttressing, a much greater surface area to the base of the tree. The trees themselves widen at the base, helping with that surface area, because in a wet soil you need to have pretty solid footing. So a wide leaf base paired with an extended and substantial and weighty root system can help these trees stand up in stagnant water. Fungus has historically been given to the botanists to study. But botanists are plant scientists, and mycologists are fungal scientists. They're in a separate kingdom altogether. They're not a plant, they're not an animal, they're a fungus. They're actually closer on the tree of life to animals than they are to plants. They're made of animal proteins. The majority of that fungus is growing inside this wood as just tiny little microscopic hollow tubes that can digest their environment. So the majority of the organism is digesting this wood. And every once in a while, it decides it needs to reproduce. So it breaks through the surface of whatever it's eating and produces these spore-producing structures that we know as the mushrooms and in this case, the bracket fungus. So these are reproducing, but the organism inside is going to continue to live until its environment is completely gone.